Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Teaching About Race, Ethnicity, and Crime with Shaun Gabbidon. My name is Jill Ragusa, and I am the Field Marketer for Criminology and Criminal Justice at Sage Publishing. This one-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it to all registrants in the coming weeks. This session is typically part of our SAGE ACJS Faculty Development Workshop series. With the cancellation of ACJS, we decided to move these workshops to a virtual format and open it up to the broader academic community. We are thrilled you are here today or watching the recording of this webinar. A huge thank you to our workshop coordinator, Brian Payne, for pulling all of this together. We do have a few more workshops coming up in this fall, including using courseware in your criminal justice courses and publishing and finding time to write. Be on the lookout for these invites coming in August. If you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for Q&A from attendees, so please also use that Q&A box to ask any questions to the speaker throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag #SageTalks and feel free to ask questions or leave comments there. Let me begin by introducing you to our speaker. Shaun Gabbidon is a distinguished professor of criminal justice in the School of Public Affairs at Penn State, Harrisburg. He earned his PhD in criminology at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Gabbidon has served as a fellow at Harvard University's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for Afro-American Research and as an adjunct faculty member in the Center for Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. His areas of interest include race and crime, criminal justice and criminology pedagogy, and private security. Professor Gabbidon is the author of more than 100 scholarly publications, including 60 peer-reviewed articles and 11 books. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Shaun Gabbidon.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Sage for inviting me to do this, and also Dr. Hella Taylor Green, who did this prior to me taking over, and she gave me some good insights on some things that might be useful for participants. In addition, some of you who are viewing the webinar also have adopted my books, and I really appreciate the support over the years. What I'm going to try to do today is simply go through some of the things that I do in my course. Everyone teaches this course a little differently, but maybe there are some core things that I do that may be useful for you as you either attempt to teach the course for the first time, or it may enhance what you're currently doing if you're currently teaching the course. What I want to do by starting out is simply conduct a little poll. And the first thing well, actually the poll is just one question. The first thing I want you to think about is, one second. Not sure why. Let's see. Why my PowerPoint isn't advancing. One second. Okay, this should do it. All right, so the first thing is, why teach a course on race, ethnicity, and crime? There are a multitude of answers here, so I just want you all to just select an answer, and then we'll talk about this a little bit more. Okay. Well, it seems as though it is necessary is the winner here. I will say when I first thought about teaching this course, I actually thought it would be really fun. It was an area I was interested in. Um, what I quickly learned that the other two things on here were equally as important. That yes, it is necessary and it can be quite a challenge. So to me, all of the above, but sometimes number one, it is fun, is not necessarily what it turns into. Uh, Moving on in terms of what I do in the course, there's a few things that I think about when I think about the course. Um, and I'm having technical difficulties after the poll here. One second. Not really sure what happened to my, okay, there we go. Okay, my course objectives are typically these. First, to explain the history of the concept of race ethnicity. Second, to appraise the past and current status of the influence of race ethnicity on justice system outcomes. Third, contrast the criminological theories used to explain racial disparities in crime, because there are a multitude of theories out there. And what I attempt to do is to not only look at sort of what we consider the more mainstream theories. I typically approach the course by saying, okay, let's look at the wider spectrum of theories. So even though I say criminological theories, I talk about psychological theories, but I mean a whole host of theories that are typically not discussed in our field. I also want to differentiate both the discrimination thesis and the non-discrimination thesis, which is essentially a discussion about the issue that we see. Is it disproportionate offending or is it discriminatory treatment? I think it's a very important discussion for the students to have. I know the book, The Color of Justice, is an excellent book to, that goes through this discussion. And as even though during this talk, I'm going to talk about some of my books and what they do, I think it's important to understand there are other good resources out there for this. And that book does a good job, at least of addressing that issue, because that's kind of the focus of the entire book to answer this question. And also just describe the current trends in the race and crime literature. And these objectives are also dependent upon the level of the course. Sometimes if I'm teaching a graduate course, I often go even more into policy things where I might have them serve as like a crime commission dealing with this issue, and different things like that I may add depending upon what course it is and what level it is. I also always address race and definitional issues, as you see in crime text. We get into this, it's important for them to understand what race is. It's a social construct, and also just talking about how people view it in terms of the biology related to race, the biosocial, the rise of the biosocial perspective in the field, and some of these other issues that a Black person can have multiple different backgrounds. For me, for example, I was born in England to Jamaican parents. I was raised in the United States. So there's a lot of things when we just simply talk about race, we have to let people understand that there is that sort of diversity within these socially constructed racial categories. Crime and justice, I go through discussing this very in detail because I take this stance. Sort of Nils Christie has published a book years ago where it was called A Suitable Amount of Crime, where he talks about crime does not really exist, acts exist, and what we define as a crime could depend on a whole host of things. Just as we think about the changing nature of how we deal with marijuana, whereas years ago so many people would have been incarcerated for what they're doing marijuana use today, we decide it's okay now. So that impacts upon crime statistics. So I emphasize to students, we have to really understand what we talk about when we talk about crime. It is also something that is socially constructed. I also get into the discussion about justice and what that means, what actually is justice, and we have a good discussion about that. One of the things I did maybe about a decade or so ago, I started noticing a lot of literature in other countries. We tend to be all American centered. And because of my background, I got curious and I wrote a book and Sage did publish the first edition of it. It didn't really, people kind of, I don't think people really got it at the time. But there's an international dilemma that relates to this particular issue. So sometimes when I teach the course, I have had an emphasis on international issues related to race and justice. And the whole course, we look at different countries and we find a lot of the same things, and the students are amazed at that. But I think with the more recent things that have gone on nationally here in the United States, and we see the protests in other countries, it's not just solidarity, it's the understanding that these issues are affecting other societies as well. It just so happens that other countries sort of look to us for direction. I remember not too long ago, I went to the London School of Economics and gave a presentation, and the criminologists there, they were all in awe of what we were doing here, because they feel like they look to us for a lot of direction. So it's important for us to also look at what they're going through at times. So sometimes a course will veer in that direction. Approaching the course, I pretty much used the same approach for the last 20 plus years. And I've taught the course at Coppin State College and Coppin State University now in Baltimore, which is primarily a historically Black college. I've taught it at Penn State Harrisburg, which is pretty much a white, predominantly white institution, and University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League institution that has primarily white students. But no matter what I do, I always use the socio-historical approach. And that's simply because students are basically ignorant of the topic, just like citizens are. They believe Blacks commit the majority of crime in the United States, the majority of serious crime in the United States. And you really have to have that in your mind as you're going through this course, because you want to provide them with evidence that will dispel some of these myths. I put here the public also believes this, simply because I've done some research recently. Another presentation I've done, I've shared some of these numbers. But a Penn State poll, which is just Pennsylvanians, just looked at the question, which group is arrested for the largest proportion of serious crime? And as you can see in here, the respondents were primarily said Blacks. So it's a common societal problem. You have an opportunity in this class to dispel some of that, because we know if this is the perception, other things result from that perception. From there, I mean, this also talks about, this table just shows you that basically this holds across all racial ethnic groups. So you may have, a variety of students, a diverse set of students in your class, but a lot of them actually believe the same stuff. And one of the things I do the first day of class, like some of my colleagues have suggested they do as well, is you just ask students to put down each racial group and racial ethnic group, and then you ask them to, provide the percentage of arrests for each of the major serious offenses. So you just say whites, Blacks, and Native Americans, and so on down the road. And then you deal with ethnicity separately. But the exercise shows that most people believe what we see in these tables. And that's sort of the starting point for me for the discussion about, okay, well, why is this? Why did you think what you think? And, we have some initial really heart-to-heart discussions about the topic at that point. Approaching the course, I use a multitude of things, just like in any other course. We try and mix it up, multiple textbooks, monographs, articles. As the course becomes more advanced, I use more different resources. But you can see here, today, your instructors are fortunate. You have YouTube. You can basically have a guest speaker anytime you want. You can go online and somebody's talking about a particular topic. I use, advocacy agencies, materials, both from the left and from the right. I approach the course from the vantage point that I want students, I'm going to present students with information. It's really up to them to make a determination. I don't go into the course saying, okay, well, I have to convince them that there's bias in the criminal justice system or I fail. No, I have to convince them there's a lot of evidence out there, information out there that will help provide them the knowledge to come to their own conclusion. That conclusion may often not be that the system is biased, but I can tell you that's not always the conclusion. But it also, by presenting all sides, it allows them to see the arguments on both sides. And I think people coming into the field, if they're passionate about this topic, they have a propensity to want to say, okay, I'm going to tell them this is the way the system is. Well, if you provide them with a multitude of evidence, they will come to a conclusion on their own. I use a variety of documentaries. I think the top two here are things that I would consider to be mandatory in terms of either these documentaries or others. that approach these topics. Scottsboro talks about the Scottsboro cases from the 1930s. I think just looking at those cases will enlighten them a little more than they get in the classroom, because in the other classes, I should say, because the Scottsboro case actually had 2 Supreme Court rulings, and when we talk about criminal procedures and things like that. So this gives the background. Most of the time I ask the students before they watch it, have you heard of Powell versus Alabama? They're like, yeah. Well, this is what it's all about. So I think it provides context for what they're learning in either a criminal law course or the intro courses, a bit more context. The Zoot Suit Rights, I think, is also a very good video, because we're so East Coast centric in all that we do. We don't realize there's a West Coast sometimes. We think, oh, it's, racism was in the South, and we just talk about that so much. We don't realize that the West Coast, there were things happening there as well for the Mexican population in the 1940s. And I think the Zoot Suit Rights brings it all together to some extent. So I think that's just something to consider. The other ones, people like gangs in New York. Why would you show a movie a gang? Well, some people use that in a gang class, but I use it because one of the things that I realize students have is they all have short memories, and they all sort of ahistorical. And when we think of today and we think of violent, gangs, people say, oh yeah, there's Hispanic gangs, there's the black gangs, but this movie does a good job of showing the historical development of gangs among white ethnics. And that is very important that we emphasize that gangs are not new. What we see today, there's a long heritage in America with them. Murder on a Sunday Morning, again, it's a little older, probably 2001 documentary that looks at a particular case in Jacksonville, Florida, where a young man was falsely accused of a particular crime. But the beauty of that is that it sort of dispels a stereotype about public defenders, that particular system. It talks about how important public defense is, because their public defender was committed to this case despite all of the other things that were going on related to the case. And he actually, the young man was acquitted. But it's a great look at a case from start to finish. And it's actually just, it's just wonderfully done. I think it actually won an Academy Award for documentary. Anyway, Girlhood is a documentary that I think a lot of people know about who's been in the field for a while. It just follows females in the juvenile justice system of several years. And Fantastic Lives is one that I've been trying to get to use in my classes for a while, particularly my online class when I teach this online. But it's been, ESPN has been very tough in getting, didn't want to really allow me to use it or allow us to use it, but they finally did. I used it this past semester, and students just really loved the documentary. It goes through the Duke lacrosse case, and it just provides a different angle on this, and also talks about how media and race can interact in different ways than we typically see in these type of documentaries. I mean, there's a whole host of other resources or documentaries out there. As we know now, there is just an opportunity to have so many more engagements with things from the past, because people are doing some wonderful things related to documentary. I mean, we have Ava DuVernay. She's done the 13th, When They See Us. I mean, there's Essential Part 5 documentary. There's just countless other things. I know I just watched a webinar at the University of Florida with Paul Butler, who was talking about his book and some of the ideas in it called Chokehold. You can find that online. I mean, these things are just fantastic resources. The socio-historical approach, as I just said, student society have a short memory. So the way I approach is I do my best to provide that historical amnesia that people tend to have. Many students actually have not, once they get to college, have not really engaged any of this stuff that's on the slides, and it's really incumbent upon me. I have them for a semester. I at least have to expose them to this stuff. And a lot of times that's where the not so fun comes in, because some people are offended because they're like, well, that has nothing to do with me. This is 2020, that happened. Well, how does this connect? And you kind of have to explain how it connects. From there, when you think about other things, one of the things that I was fortunate to have when I was coming through my education at University of Baltimore, I had a professor named Ann Sultan, and she was just brilliant in terms of adding so much to enhance my education by talking about minority scholars. And it just intrigued me as a minority scholar, a minority student myself. I was like, wow, I'd gone through other education. I didn't know any of these people really wrote on crime. I may have heard the names, but I think that's something that more and more today, people want to hear what minorities have to say, as if we didn't have something to say in the past, but now we know that they did. So it's incumbent upon us to expose people to that literature as well, and to let people know it wasn't just a Chicago school talking about crime. It wasn't just others of the early times that we go through talking about this particular issue. Teaching basics. I use thought-provoking readings. I've used All God's Children probably for definitely more than a decade. And it's just a book that shows the experience of a family from the slave period to now, and their struggles with violence, racism, and a whole host of things. But it's very good at also exposing students to theory and how it connects. Some people don't like it because they say it's a book that sort of deals with pathology, things like that. But if you approach it the right way, that book is powerful. I don't think I've ever had a class where students don't say this book has not moved them in one way or another. Honky is something I used to use. It was sort of a book that sort of talked about a white person, a white scholar who lived in Brooklyn, and his experiences. And it's very good with white privilege, the concept of white privilege. And then Code of the Suburbs. One of the big things I think people come into the discipline or teaching this course for the first time need to consider is that we can't talk about inner city crime the whole semester, because that's not where all the crime is. If we do that, we do a disservice, and people that come in with stereotypes are going to leave the course with stereotypes. Code of the Suburbs is a book that was published about 5 years ago, and it basically looks at what's going on in terms of drug dealing among wealthier white kids, white families in the suburbs. And students are just like, it's interesting because particularly some of white students, obviously, they say, yeah, this was happening in my neighborhood. I mean, I have that constantly, but the reality is that the numbers that they get are not reflective of these type of activities, because most of these youth or people who are involved in the suburbs, they never get brought into those crime statistics. So if you think back to what I was talking about in terms of Nils Christie, I mean, the numbers, there's context to those numbers, and all semester I sort of reinforce that. Honest discussion about racial disparities and racial discrimination. I talked about that already. Teaching both sides of the debate. One of the features in my current book, current edition of Race and Crime, is that there's something called Both Sides of the Debate, where I basically discuss both sides of an issue. It's very crucial we do that, because it enhances the knowledge of people who may only have one side. Like, yes, all minorities are racially profiled. And other people might be, no, minorities. Well, if you provide literature on both sides of the question, and there is literature on both sides of the question, it enhances their knowledge overall. And it's also obviously a more enriching experience for them too. Now, I have here Suspect Citizens. And I say, well, if you use that book, it's important for people to understand that book relates to 20 million traffic stops in North Carolina, and they convincingly show that there's a bias in stops. So it's an interesting book if you have a chance to read that. It's sort of just as background for your discussions. Stay away from solely discussing inner city crime. I already talked about that. There are lots of other issues. I know in my current book, I made a current edition of Race and Crime. I made a particular effort to include other things. School shootings. I talk about school shootings. I go through the whole literature on that in a highlight box that just sort of talks about it. And affluenza, I also have a highlight box on that. I mean, there's some things that we just don't talk about because we spend so much time on other things. And in a sense, it's hard to realize this, but we actually can perpetuate negative stereotypes if we're not careful how much we devote to certain things in this particular course. Because the course is Race, Ethnicity, and Crime. It's not a course on Blacks. It's not a course on Hispanics. It's a course on all of the various groups. Teaching the class will vary based upon the format of the class, online and residence. I can tell you online students are much more willing to say what's on their mind. I've taught it in residence as well, obviously, and both of those modalities results in different things. And sometimes you go in residence, it's very hard to get students to really want to talk about the topic. That also can depend on a variety of things. But I can tell you, when I was at Coppin State in Baltimore and the population was 97% Black, I had no problem getting them to communicate. It's just the opposite. When I did have white students, they more than likely did not participate, just like it's kind of reversed when I was at Penn State Harrisburg and the University of Penn. So, I mean, you have to kind of work at this to get that additional participation. The level of class, again, sometimes, what you do in an undergraduate class and a graduate class is going to vary. But I would say in my program, the course is required. But if you're getting students where the course wasn't required, you can have graduate students that know actually nothing really significant about this topic. The location institution, I would teach it the same whether I was teaching in Texas, Pennsylvania, here in Pennsylvania, Maryland. However, you also have to be aware of the context of what's going on in your particular state. That's one of the things that I don't think our field does a good enough job at, is making people understand that there is not one criminal justice system. Each state, each locality, they have different things going on. Just like there are 18,000 different policing agencies in the United States, we need to emphasize these type of things. And if you're in a particular state, you should know what's going on this in regards to this topic in your state. Also, as I said earlier, I mean, there's an emphasis on the U.S., but it's nice to educate students on this other international context, especially with some of the protests around the country. It requires us to say, why are they protesting? It didn't happen there. We have to kind of make sure students understand it. Why? Teaching challenges, demographics, age, race, gender, the class, that again is something to think about. The university's racial climate. I mean, if your school has a bad racial climate, that will sort of rear its head in your class. So you're gonna, you should be prepared for that. There is student resistance. And I'm going to share some stuff later on. There are students, they have a perspective, and anything you say, they're challenging it. So I mean, you just have to be ready for that. It doesn't happen all the time, but you just have to be ready to deal with that. You have to establish boundaries, because order can quickly turn into disorder in the classroom, and you have to kind of stop it right away, especially when you notice that certain discussions are basically going off the rails. And I do this online too. When I teach it online, people are free to type in whatever comments, and I tell them ahead of time, have respect, whatever. But then you'll get the email from the student saying, I was offended by this particular comment, and I have a sidebar email or conversation with the student who may have said something offensive, and I just let them know that, that wasn't appropriate. Your race, ethnicity, gender, these things all matter. I know that when I talk to my Black female college teaching the course, there's a certain different tenor to those interactions. I'm 6'3", somebody who's maybe shorter, of a less stature, I'm not going to say they try to intimidate you, but I'm just going to say that sometimes that becomes an issue in certain situations. And I've seen that. I've talked to people about it. I haven't seen it. But. So, thinking about the course, this is a big thing. Evaluation. You want to teach the course. You have all these things. You do it. You want to. Obviously, this is very important for the tenure promotion. So these are the last. I did a quick calculation earlier about these last 10 all. See, my ratings are pretty good. All right. I've been teaching it. I probably taught it for every semester for the last 20 plus years. So I would hope it would be good at this point. But I think it's important to know that students, because they come in with a particular perception, sometimes no matter what you do to enlighten them, they're really not going to be appreciative of it at that moment. You can only hope that later on they will be. And those are the students that are actually going to give you, lower marks. You're going to have some of that. I remember when I first started teaching at Penn State, and I had taught this course for multiple semesters at Coppin State, and I did a study. I actually had it published in the Journal of Criminal Justice Education. I wanted to see if what was the role of race and course content in evaluation scores, because the two courses I taught at my old school were research methods, which is actually my favorite course to teach. It just happens that I don't teach it anymore, but I like it because it just it opens up possibilities when you learn research. So I actually like teaching that course the most. And sometimes you don't have to deal with some of the things you have to deal with this course. This just happens to be the most important course. It's essential, as we said. It's necessary. But anyway, so I looked at this, and I looked at those 2 courses when I taught them at Coppin State, and I looked at the 2 courses at Penn State. And when I did my analysis, I found that really there was no difference between my scores in terms of the research methods course. Those were actually the same. But the content in the race and crime course was my scores were a little bit lower at Penn State, Harrisburg. So, I mean, there is that effect, but it's not something that you can't overcome. And the more society talks about this stuff, it's hopeful that people understand the significance of it in taking the course. So here you see some comments. This was a great course, learned a lot of information, exams were tough, but the essay paper helped to make up for that. And here again, I mean, this is, as I said, people love the All God's Children book. There are other books out there I'm sure that you could use, and other people would probably provide suggestions, but if you're trying to connect theory into some of what we see, that's good, as well as the Code of the Suburbs book. It does the same thing, it applies theory, but in that case, it's sort of dealing with whites in the suburbs. So that's valuable. The way the course was designed does well in teaching the concepts of this course. The only real change that needs to be made is removing unneeded areas of courses that do not contribute anything to the learning process. Watching Gangs of New York didn't help this person. Eating All God's Children and the farcical concept of white privilege all did little than add unneeded work to the course. You're going to have this. Students are not really, because if you look at the second part of that evaluation, you'll see of that comment, you'll see the course comps and learning objectives are easily covered without these assignments, and having them in the course does not help students gain the knowledge. So, I mean, they are saying that they didn't get anything out of it, but I'm sure as these concepts and things that are in those books come up in society, they'll be well versed and ready to address them, even if they didn't like having it in the course. And here again, movies, documentaries, mix it up. I mean, we all like to believe that we can lecture for hours at a time, and people are just sitting on the edge of their seats, waiting for the next hour, and that's just not true. We know that, right? If you mix it up, I think the mix of documentaries and even movies, if you can find a good movie, the students get into it as long as it covers something of relevance to them. They really enjoy that. Okay, proposed changes to the course. Well, first of all, don't have anybody schedule you 8 o'clock for this class, because first of all, it's a tough class to begin with, but then you got to get them at 8 o'clock and ready to go to talk about stuff that many of them don't want to talk about. So that's a bad idea. And this was nice. They decided to keep the book, All right, the book report. I find it boring that I had to do a book report in college. So I guess they just figured at high school, book reports are done. It's never going to be done again. But obviously, I required them to read a book. But if you look at it, the concept, it did help interpret, the comment, it did help interpret the material, but I found it a boring read and it made it hard to focus on the paper. It helped them interpret the material. So to me, that's a good comment that it actually worked for what I said. Hire a professor. Now, this is the one that some of you you're gonna get some of this. Hire a professor who does not push his own agenda and thoughts on the class. As a result of having a differentiating opinion, you have pointed deducted because you do not think like him. I failed in that case because that's not what I do in the class. I don't penalize anybody. That's the first thing I tell them, that I don't really care what your opinion is. I just want you to have some thoughts on the topic. But because some students are resistant to even taking the course, we require it. They have to take it. They believe, you're going to receive some comments like this at some point in your career if you teach this course long enough. These are a couple of things that I got just this past summer, a few weeks ago when class ended, a couple of weeks ago when class ended. I just wanted to say thank you for a great end to my time at Penn State. I really enjoyed the course and the variety of insightful books, articles, documentaries, and movies that we've read and watched over the past 6 weeks, as well as discussion. Thanks again for everything. Last one, I just wanted to send you an email before class is over and thank you for this semester and this class. It opened my eyes to so many other aspects in the field and has really set my passion for criminal justice on fire. The whole course replay challenges of one's opinion on certain topics while showing you another side to it rather than being a one-sided opinion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So for me, that's success on all counts there, because they enjoyed the course, it challenged their opinions, and they realized that I provided them with two sides of the argument, which is what's going on in society right now. So that person is going to be well, versed in all of the angles related to this question as they go into the field. And we have to understand that's the reality of what we're trying to do here. People are going to the field. We should at least provide them some context for what they're going to see in the field. If we don't do that, I think as criminal justice as a discipline, we failed. We need to provide them with this. And some people say, yes, we do it in this course, we do it in that course, we do it in this course. But we need to emphasize it, make sure that there is some systematic way that students get this before they go out in the field. And I think that's just something, I don't think the field has really come to that conclusion yet, because most programs offer this course as an elective, not as a required course. But I know I've been talking to Catherine Russell Brown at University of Florida, and both of us believe it just should be required to take this course before we before students go off into the field. In terms of other things, I mean, again, you can teach the course a multitude of ways, but I would just suggest that you think about what your core objectives are, and you just provide them with a multitude of ways to get that information rather than just lecturing. All right, well, they said to talk for about 40 minutes. I'm pretty close to that, I think. I want to open up for particular questions, and I'm going to let them take over and provide the questions for me. Okay, so let me see what I need to do here. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Shaun, for that very informative presentation. Now we're going to spend some time addressing some of the questions from the audience. Please continue to send them into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, or using the Twitter hashtag #SageTalks. So the first question we have is, for those of us teach the standalone class on race, crime, and justice, do you have any suggestions for incorporating this material into other CJ classes, for example, Intro CJ?
Well, I will say that the field has changed tremendously since I came into it about 25 years ago or so, because most texts actually try to address it in some cases, whereas in the past, many people didn't really want it in these type of other classes, because they're like, well, they don't really want to have those discussions. So how can you bring it in? It's through additional readings. You have to look at the book that you're using and go through it with a fine comb to see how they address key topics. And where they are lacking, you have to find that reading. And I know that's more reading, but there's lots of short pieces out there that you can get that will just quickly add to what's lacking in those texts. So it's additional readings, but I know how students are like, oh, another reading. Well, yes, but another short and to the point reading that will sort of enhance what's in the text.
Great, thank you. How do you deal with trigger warnings or students who find the material extremely triggering, particularly students who have dealt with some of these issues in their lives?
Well, I talk to students about this at the beginning of the class, and I've rarely had, and I have, but I've rarely had students who have had these issues bubble up in class. I mean, it's a real thing because, as in my experience, I mean, I gave a talk not long ago. I was talking about, I have had some of these issues. So, in the talk I just gave, I told them about my nephew who was killed by the Philadelphia Police Department. So when I talk about policing and brutality and police killings, I actually had that happen in my family. So, I mean, I have to kind of say, okay, well, I let them know that if there's something that they, feel uncomfortable with, they can come talk to me and we can talk about it. But, you just have to deal with that on a case-by-case situation. There's no easy way to deal with it. I know in the online class, I often have students, of a variety of backgrounds, not just, Black students or Hispanic students who have had something happen, and they'll talk about it in the particular discussion forum. And you know what? A lot of people their response is, thank you for sharing. You know, in other cases though, you'll have people talk about their instance, and other people will say, well, that's just, sorry to hear about that, but this, it's not a bigger issue than that. So it comes up, but I've never had a student who has been triggered by something and it not be addressed in a way that they left the class with a good feeling.
Great. How do you teach this course in an online format?
I have 12 lessons and I have 3 exams, so it's a 15-week course. I teach it, let's be honest, I teach it using my texts. I have 2 texts that I use in there. I use the race and crime text with Sage. I use criminological perspectives on race and crime, which is with Routledge. And then I use the All God's Children, and I use Code of the Suburbs. So I teach it the same way. It's just that I have all the videos. It's just that I generally have a lot more discussion forums because you have to be more aggressive in terms of keeping them engaged. When I'm in class, I can just, it's easy just to on your feet come up with things for them to think about, or it's a little harder online because the way I teach it, it's asynchronous. So you got to have stuff out there for them to address each week. And for me, I have at least 2 or 3 discussion forums with students each week where it's a different topic, it's a different reading, and that kind of that keeps them active and keeps them engaged, and they're required to post something, and at least 1 or 2, actually at least 2 posts for each discussion forum. Some substantive posts of their own, and also a response to one of their classmates. It works. It works. Some of those scores are my online scores, so it's not, it's a lot of work, but in the end, it can be done.
Great, thank you. What are some of the times when students have aha moments in the class, and how do you facilitate their getting to that realization?
Sometimes it takes a whole semester to get that aha moment because they're just one day, just reading through stuff, and other times it's a little bit before the end of the semester after they read All God's Children. I think that book takes them through a journey, that allows them to see how not only sort of the historical part of it in terms of, going back, but it also takes them through the psychological part of it. It takes them through mental illness. It takes them through various theories, social disorganization theory. I asked them to basically tell me what theories we've learned connects to this book, and they just go through it, and they actually enjoy the exercise because it's something that actually relates to what they're doing. So the book talks about discrimination, it talks about hope, it talks about disappointment. There's just so much stuff that most of the students tell me once they pick it up, they can't put it down, and that's the way that book has been for the last however many years I've been using it. So they get that moment, and a lot of them do. Some of them don't. I can tell you, went through a whole class, and people are just like, they just don't see the value of why the course is required. But it doesn't matter what they see the value is. We've assessed it, and our program assessed that this is one of the most valuable courses they need to take. So, but they get it, and it's nice. I get lots of those emails, and I get lots of students who are interested in the particular topic, and for me. But I know that I'm hoping that as they go into the field, if they go into policing or courts, correction, whatever, these things will be on their mind when they have crucial decisions to make.
Thank you. How do you make students of color comfortable to discuss race when in a predominantly white school and there are only 2 to 3 Black students in the course?
Well, the one thing you don't do is just ask them, okay, well, what's your opinion? don't single them out. I think it's important that you make sure that they feel, I mean, they're going to feel probably like I did when I was a student and something about race happened to come up, and I went to predominantly white institutions. You're still going to have that thing in your stomach, like, okay, but you want to make sure the environment that you set, that they understand that, I mean, I guess I'll just say like that you have their back if the discussion gets out of control. Okay. And that simply means that you will cut the discussion off and you will basically, I usually do it quietly. I'll talk to the other student. I may say something in class, but I may talk to the student later about what transpired in class. So you really just have to have the students back to let them know. Similarly, if a white student has particularly a particular perspective that is against what the majority of the class is, you have to make them feel comfortable also expressing their views, and that while other people don't agree with them, you're happy that they're willing to their views. And it's the same thing for all of the students. I try to create that environment where everybody feels comfortable. It doesn't always happen in the sense that everybody leaves the class necessarily happy. Most people are fine. Every now and then people are like, oh, this person, they just kept saying the same thing. You'll see some of that on the reviews. They'll say repetitive this or repetitive that. But if you hear it enough, maybe it'll sink into you that there's something here that at least needs to be addressed.
Thank you. How do we compete with the false narrative found in the media and the students' willingness to believe whatever they see?
Well, that's why we provide them with the evidence, right? The evidence is the research that's out there. It's the experiences that people have. As I said, I was talking about this book, The Suspect Citizens by Baumgartner and his colleagues. They're political scientists. I don't know if it's picked up much in our field. Maybe, it will. But you have a situation where you have a state, and you have people in that state who don't believe that profiling is going on. And these people get access to 20 million traffic stops over a period of time. And they, in excruciating detail, go through where this bias is occurring. Because again, we have to re-emphasize to our students that if you look at justice systems in North Carolina, there are many of them. If you look at police agencies, there are many of them. So what's going on in one isn't necessarily going on in another, but they had access to enough data to tell you exactly where it was going on. And that's, I think, powerful. Because just me standing up there saying, okay, well, I've published 20 books on the topic or whatever it is, I know everything. That doesn't work. Sometimes students need that additional evidence. And then even then, as we know in our society now, where people are sort of anti-science to some extent, it's always going to be a challenge, but that doesn't mean that we should abandon attempting to educate our students.
Great. This is similar to a question you answered, but a little different. If you had 2 to 3 lectures within a broader course, for example, Intro to Criminology, to talk about race and crime, what would you focus on or prioritize?
I would prioritize the front end of the system. And I'm not just talking about policing, I'm talking about law. One of the things that we don't emphasize enough is how sort of legislative processes drive all of this stuff, from the practices of the police to the courts. I would spend a lot of time on that. I would also spend a lot of time on obviously policing, because it's just that entity that people need to really understand what this is and where it came from. I would go through the historical foundations of policing. And finally, I would go through the courts in the sense of the Supreme Court and the power in which they have had over, centuries, over their existence to really shape what goes on in terms of criminal justice policy. That's another thing that I think is under discussed or not really, discussed to the extent that it should be. So those things, and they will if you discuss those enough in those 3 classes you have, I think they'll have a better understanding. It's not that corrections isn't important, but corrections, what we see in corrections is a product of what happens at the front end of the system. I always remember a professor saying, you think about all the stuff that happens before, and then you go into corrections, you got to deal with basically the policies that other people have put in place in other parts of the system. So whether that be the legislature, whether that be policing, the corrections, they're just taking the brunt of it there. I mean, it's taking the brunt of policies in many cases, as we know now, bad policies that contribute to mass incarceration.
Thank you. How has the current pandemic and national discourse about race impacted your courses?
Well, the course that I just taught, it was interesting that, obviously this is all went on while I was teaching a course on race and crime. So we had lots of discussions about this, the pandemic, less so, more so, the high profile killings and things like that. And I think my students were equipped for the discussion. Because of what was being talked about in the class, but there was still debate about the situation, because I often have law enforcement officers. I have, a wide variety of people from different walks of life that work in the system. And it's interesting, they provide the other students with sort of a different perspective. It's not that it's right, it's not that it's wrong, it's just a different perspective. But having worked in the field, a lot of times those people have a tendency to give the field the benefit of the doubt. So for example, in the George Floyd case, I had former officers saying, well, let's wait to see after the investigation what really happened. That's kind of the way they approach it. And that's typical over the years. You have police officers saying that, where I could say a black student in my class who was more or less like, this is more of the same, and it talked about his own experiences with the police and family experiences. So you have those two things colliding. But I think the overall discourse, having had these discussions, makes it better for all involved. So even if these happen now, if they had happened later and the students had taken this course, I think they can get a better sense of things. I think they can provide a little additional context. Doesn't mean that they're going to still view it from, okay, well, yeah, this is just, they're going to look and say, yep, that's discrimination. But it means that they will understand the arguments of those people who believe that, these were racist killings. They will understand their arguments. They don't have to necessarily agree with them.
Thank you. What advice or thoughts do you have for a white professor teaching these issues?
Good luck. No, just kidding. Just kidding. No, it's it's kind of interesting, because when I was teaching at Coppin State College, it was just like, wow, all right, I have all these minority students. They were really soaking up whatever I said. I mean, it's a different kind of environment. So I think when you're a white professor, and I'm not a white professor, I don't know. I can only surmise that, and I know some of our black colleagues will attest to this. Sometimes if it comes out of a white person's mouth in some situations, people actually give it more validity than if it comes out of somebody who is closer to the issue. So I'm a black male, they're probably like, oh boy, when I start talking about things that may be on the side if there's discrimination in the system, some of those white students are probably like, oh, I knew it was coming. I knew that's what he was going to say. I got to deal with a whole semester of this. But, on this other side of it, I think my white colleagues, I mean, there's a challenge there too, because, they may have some difficulties. And sometimes if you have black students, they may be like, well, why is a white person teaching this class? You have those other things that, you have to deal with. But I mean, it's a little harder for me to say, because I'm black. I know what it's like teaching the course as a black person, but as a white person, I'm only kind of guessing the challenges you'll have. But all in all, I would say, if you provide a variety of opinions, it really shouldn't necessarily matter. if you're only one side of the discussion, that's when I think race to some extent becomes heightened in the view of you teaching the course. But again, that's just, I haven't really done any research on that particular angle, and maybe so at some point some of my white colleagues can address that, because I don't know, and I have a couple of colleagues at my program who have taught the class when I either sabbatical or whatever, and it would be interesting to see what their thoughts are. But I do know that they say it's challenging for them to teach the class.
Makes sense. How do you discuss ethnicity from an international context?
Well, one of the things that I do when I talk about ethnicity, when I do it from international, I first explain that the terms we use here are not the terms we use in other places. The way we refer to groups here are not what we use to other places, because again, we're so American centric in the way we see things. We don't necessarily think that, okay, well, okay, no, that people don't like to use certain terms that we use here, there. So I kind of explain that they're all social constructs, but they're just socially constructed differently in the different parts of the world. And then I kind of go from there. What I do is I talk about sort of the history of the country, and I tend to focus on those places where there's obviously a lot of information that I can get in English. And I talk about colonization, which, to me is interesting. Most students don't even know what colonization is, but I use it to sort of contextualize what we see in other countries. And then I kind of go from there and sort of follow the way we do it here. I look at, the laws, I look at the police, I look at the courts, I look at corrections, and, I kind of do it that way. But it can be very enriching to kind of to look outside of the United States and what's going on. The second edition of that book that, sorry, Sage, you guys didn't want the second edition, but the second edition is coming out with Routledge, but and I'm doing the book with Akwazi, who's at the University of Toronto. But again, it's a very germane topic. And if nothing more, just look at the protests around the world again. That tells you there's something that we're missing here in the States, because we are caught up in obviously the serious issues here. But having partners around the globe in this can help. Are we protesting for other countries? I think some of these things, if you introduce students to them, they may be a little bit more active in understanding that, we tend not to realize how important understanding international issues in areas that we focus on are.
Thank you. And I think the last question we have time for, so there's actually a few different participants that are asking for the list of films, documentaries, and recommended readings. Is there any way you'd be willing to share that?
Of course, none of this stuff is a secret. I mean, it's just stuff that's out there. I remember many years ago, the Division on People of Color and Crime had a newsletter where it was just on recommending documentaries and things. So I'm not an expert on all these. I'm sure there's things I'm missing, but I'll certainly share whatever I use, the books, whatever, whether they're sage or not, because to me, it's all about getting the information out there. I mean, I could tell you, recently I published a book on shopping while Black, and Routledge asked me, we want to give this away free to people, just during these times so they can read stuff on this area. I said, sure. I mean, royalties and stuff, it doesn't matter. Time where we need to get as much information out to as many people as we can. And I'm happy to share whatever I can.
Great. So what we'll do, Shaun, is if you just put together a basic Word document, I will actually post that along with the recording. So everybody will be receiving the recording within the next 2 weeks on a Sage landing page, and we'll make sure that that resource list is also on that page for you to find there.
No more questions? One more? No?
I think That is all we have time for. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and a special thank you to our speaker. Thanks again. This was great. In the coming weeks, please be on the lookout for an email that will include the link to view the entire webinar and the slides. And please stay connected with us on our blog, Sage Connection, for information and upcoming webinars. And thank you again, Shaun, so much.
Well,
Thanks,
thank you all for having me. Everyone have a great summer.